In this episode, the featured film stands on the shoulders of giants. It is a stunning example of storytelling out of Hollywood. As a leading man who is both cocky and fragile, a leading woman who is rich, aloof, and vulnerable, a musical score that elevates the film, and a director who suffered both tragedy in his youth and unspeakable tragedy as an adult just a few years before the making of this film. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Chinatown was released in 1974 and is one of those 7 films from the early 70s that are period pieces which look as good today as they did when they were released. It also is in the private detective genre, whose setting is Los Angeles in Depression-era 1937. Well, the City of Angels probably had more sinners than saints in those days, and Los Angeles was considered one of the most corrupt cities in America, perhaps second only to Chicago, in which gangsters from the Prohibition era were very dominant. So what happened to Los Angeles? How did it get to where it got? Certainly during the 30s and definitely by the time of this film, 1937. I don't know how far back we should go, but I would go back to 1929 and the US stock market crash, which created havoc throughout the Western world economically. It signaled the end of the Roaring Twenties, as they were called. It signaled the end of the jazz era, as F. Scott Fitzgerald called it. And within a couple of years, the unemployment rate was as high as 25%. So a great many Americans were suffering. There was unemployment all over the Western world, but certainly in the US it had reached as high as 25%. On top of that, there was an agricultural failure where a lot of farms, the soil, and there's lots of reasons why this happened, but the farms failed, the soil was destroyed. The Dust Bowls of the 30s are very well documented. So it was a double whammy of no work, no farms. People had to move to survive. And so where did they move? They had to move on. So the majority of these people had lost complete confidence and trust in institutions, banking institutions, government institutions, certainly anything like a police force or the courts. They felt that they had just failed them and there was no answer for that. So we have 2 groups of people. We have the group of people who were honest, abiding citizens who just had to keep moving to find work. And we had another group of people, a much smaller group, who were independent, who were decided to be outlaws, who knew how to survive by being tough. They were, in fact, of course, stone-cold killers, but they were larger-than-life creatures, such as Bonnie and Clyde, gangsters, and John Dillinger, just to name a couple. There were many, many more. So these outlaws robbed banks and stole wherever they could steal. And although they came to an unfortunate end, they were an example of this rebellion in the country. And they were very popular, and a lot of people liked them because they were fighting the institutions that most people had come to distrust and to hate. And incidentally, the FBI, you know where they have shooting practice, for the longest time the FBI with the picture, and there's a black silhouette and the circles for the bullseye, the silhouette is that of John Dillinger. So there was an outlaw class, but there was also a non-outlaw class, people who were just looking to survive. So they got on the road, and where did they have to go? Somewhere else. That's all they had to do. They had to go somewhere else where they could find work. And they had to go west. And many of these people, they would, along the highway, cities would put billboards, or towns would put up billboards on the highway that said, "Keep moving, no work here." And so they kept moving. And they kept moving until they hit the end of the line, which was the Pacific Ocean, and therefore California, and the biggest city in California, which would have been Los Angeles. Well, it's not good to be unemployed. It's not good to be homeless. It's not good to be starving. But with the climate of California, and specifically in the Los Angeles area, it wasn't the worst place in the world to end up, although it was, these people were desperate. These people were unemployed. They were starving, but they tried to find a way to make ends meet, or at least to survive. That's a huge amount of people in Los Angeles who are of that ilk. Now, the other people in Hollywood were the same but different, and that these were the dreamers of the US, who in the same time thought Hollywood is a place where dreams come true. You could be a star, you could make a lot of money, You could be admired by millions and millions of people. So Hollywood and Los Angeles attracted these kinds of people. But of course, for every star or starlet that became famous in this journey to Hollywood, there were many thousands who did not. So we have this unemployed class of people who had moved across the country to try to find some jobs, trying to find a place where they could make a living and survive. And we had another class of people who had come to Los Angeles and Hollywood to make it in the film business and become stars and have lots of money, and most of them didn't succeed either. So we have this despairing, very, very downtrodden group of people that was very well chronicled by a writer at the time named Nathaniel West. And he wrote a book called The Day of the Locust, which was published in 1939, basically chronicling the lives of all these desperate, starving people whose hopes had been completely dashed. It was also made into a very nice film in the 70s with the same name, The Day of the Locust. So we have this Los Angeles of the late 30s with all these desperate people, either living an illegal life, living as outlaws, or on the fringes of the law. And then we have the cops. We have good cops and bad cops, but we have a police force. Well, what happens if the cops are corrupted? If the police force and the courts and the district attorneys, they're all corrupt? Some of these police officers, they would just quit and start up on their own. So they didn't have to answer to these corrupt officials. They didn't have to dance to the tune of these very rich men. And so they started private investigative agencies, or just working by themselves. Well, private investigators have been around for a long time, since the middle of the 19th century. The most famous being the Pinkerton Agency, which was very active during the Civil War in the U.S., 1861 to 1865, and were chiefly responsible for the security of President Lincoln during this time. Well, that didn't end too well, but the Pinkerton Agency was probably the most well-known and apparently flourished between 1850 and 1900, when they ended up having a lot of competition for whatever that story leads to. In fiction, there was also private investigative stories, or private detectives. And that didn't start with, but Edgar Allan Poe had a character named C. Auguste Lupin, who was a French investigator. This was in the 1840s. Move ahead to about another 40 years, and you have, of course, Sherlock Holmes, created by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I am a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. I've read many of the stories that Doyle wrote, and they're just wonderful, I think. And there are television series, even very recently, that have done a terrific job of bringing those stories to the screen. I would say movies, not so much. There's lots of reasons for that. Copyright laws, the inability to use the original stories in movies. So it didn't work out quite so well, but the television shows were great. But Holmes is as recognizable a name in this world as any. And then skip ahead another few years to 1920 with another detective writer, Agatha Christie, who created Hercule Poirot, the Belgian detective. There was the first appearance he had was in 1920 in one of her books. So we have these European private detectives, gentlemen, distinguished, brilliant, of course, solving puzzles of murder puzzles, of very intricate and hard to figure out. And that was the entertainment value of how do we solve these puzzles. Now that was very, very different from what was happening in the U.S., because in the 20s, late 20s and early 30s, there was a different kind of private detective. And this was the tough as nails, hard-bitten, street-smart detective that were formerly cops on the beat. So the writers of the 20s were very, very different than these writers in Europe, Christie and Conan Doyle. And so they made these tough cops. Now they made these tough cops with lurid stories, a lot of violence, a lot of sexy women, Westerns as well. And these stories flourished. The public just loved them. And they were also made very cheaply. So the authors literally got pennies to write these stories, and they were sold in magazines, very, very cheap magazines made from wood pulp paper, hence the term pulps or pulp fiction. So there were good writers, there were bad writers, and there were some great writers. And one of those great writers was a guy named Dashiell Hammett out of San Francisco. Well, he was very successful in the pulps, and some of these writers made much more money than others. Most of them didn't make very much, but Hammett did very well. And I think he had published a novel, but in 1930 he published the quintessential detective novel called The Maltese Falcon, with an immortal detective's name, whose name was Sam Spade. And this was a game changer in the world of private detective fiction and in the genre. It's a wonderful book. I've read it. It's really great. And Hammett was praised for being more than just another private detective writer, a pulp writer. He had an immense talent, wordsmith, bringing hard-boiled and all the lingo that goes with the detective world. And by 1939, Hollywood had made the film. 1941, they made the film The Maltese Falcon, starring an actor who would become immortalized for his role in this film. So Hammett started the ball rolling, or at least was at the pinnacle of this genre. In the 30s, of course, there were many more. These magazines, these pulp magazines, kept churning out material, and a lot of authors were trying to make a living doing this. And again, there were some good ones and some not so good ones. But then we have another character appears on the scene. Born in the U.S., raised in England, very well educated in what he called a second tier public school, what we call private schools. Served in the Great War. And when the war ended, he found himself in 1919 in California, in Los Angeles. And he was making a living doing whatever he could. So that by the late 20s, early 30s, he was writing for some of these magazines, but he was also an oil executive. But it turned out he figured that he was pretty good at writing, and he eventually published a novel in 1939. And that novel was The Big Sleep. And his detective was Philip Marlowe. This author's name was Raymond Chandler. And between Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler, they epitomized the world of the private detective in North America. The hard-boiled, tough as nails, who lived by a code, who had a heart of gold, who stood up to all these forces of corruption. The Big Sleep was the next in line of these terrific, terrific stories. Was made into a movie by Hollywood in '46. So Hollywood embraced these stories and started making. They had made gangster films in the 30s, a lot of very good gangster films, and now they were making private eye films that really caught on with the public, and they did so from the early 40s right to the present day. They've been making these films, wonderful films. So Chandler and Hammett had done something incredible. Hammett only wrote a few novels. All he had to do was write one, The Maltese Falcon and Sam Spade, and that would have been enough. Chandler wrote only seven novels with Philip Marlowe as the lead. 6 of these 7 novels were made into movies, and some of them have been made more than once. My favorites are The Big Sleep, Farewell My Lovely, and The Long Goodbye. Farewell My Lovely made more than a couple of times, but they're all, I think, terrific novels. And they all feature the hero Philip Marlowe, who is a detective. So who is this detective? What is the archetypal detective hero in all these stories? And you can read them and say, well, they're tough guys with a heart of gold, and they live by a code. Most of them were ex-cops or maybe in the district attorney's offices, and they're fighting the system. But Raymond Chandler did us a favor, because in 1944, he wrote an essay. And that essay was eventually included in a book of short stories he published a few years later. But this essay was called The Simple Art of Murder. And in this essay, Chandler talks about these European detectives and how they differed and he felt were inferior to the US versions. He also sung the praises of Hammett in this essay, and goes to great length to talk about the whole world of detective writing and these people. And it's really worth reading. It's a wonderful piece of writing. But in the last few paragraphs, he describes Philip Marlowe. He describes the quintessential detective. And it's a very famous piece of writing. And it begins, "But down these streets a man must go, who himself is not mean." And I will read it to you now. who is neither tarnished nor afraid. He is the hero. He is everything. He must be a complete man and a common man, and yet an unusual man. He must be the best man in his world and a good enough man for any world. He is a lonely man, and his pride is that you will treat him as a proud man, or you will be very sorry you ever saw him. The story in this man's adventure in search of a hidden truth, and it would be no adventure if it did not happen to a man fit for adventure. If there were enough like him, the world would be a very safe place to live in, without becoming too dull to be worth living in. And that was 1944, and that is the absolute description of who these private detectives are, the best of which. And when we return to Chinatown, we find that our hero, whose name in the movie is Jake Gittes, is exactly this kind of person. And this private investigator in a very corrupt city who has a code, who used to be a cop or worked with the district attorney, who does very menial work, because private investigators, that's what they did. They did the things that the police force wouldn't do. Searching for runaway kids, maybe proving a spouse's infidelity to the other spouse. If the cops wouldn't get involved, either if there wasn't any money in it for them, or if maybe there were racist reasons, and if there were murders, then it didn't matter that the murders took place in either the Latino or African American communities. But the private detectives would get there because there'd be a few bucks to be made. So this is Jake Gittes. He is like that. And in the beginning of the movie, we see right away that he's at the end of one of his cases, and we see what he's done and one of the typical things that private investigators do. But then the movie turns on a dime, and it is so much more than that, and it's really quite wonderful. Now, so we have Jake Gittes, and in the genre of private detection films, there's something very, very important, or at least that works best when we, the audience, don't know anything more than the private investigator knows, and the private investigator only knows what they see as the movie progresses. So there's no scenes where we don't see the investigator and something else is going on. So we, the audience, we know what's coming. We know who the bad guys are. We know what he's up against. We don't see that. We see only what the private detective sees. And I think this works really well. In fiction, it means they're writing in the first person. The books would say, I did this, I did that, I went here, I went there, I shot this guy shot me. It's all first person. In the movies, it means that the detective is in every scene. Now, this is one of the fun things about this genre, in that we don't know anymore. We're learning with the private detective what's going on. We're trying to figure out, what is the mystery? Who are the bad guys? What's going on here? What's really happening? In the same way the private detective is doing this. Well, this is really fun, I think, but there's also a hidden, not so much hidden, there's a real danger to this. And the danger is that in these movies, the lead character, the detective, is in every single scene of the movie. Now, why is that a problem? Let's say I really recommend this movie, Chinatown. It's just wonderful, and I think you'll really like it. I really like it. And they say, who's the star? And I say, well, it stars Jack Nicholson, who's still alive and has had an incredible career from the late 60s to the present day. And somebody says, I don't want to watch that film because I don't like him. And if he's in every scene, how can I enjoy that film? Because I don't like that actor. Well, I have to confess that I'm not a big Jack Nicholson fan for reasons that don't matter. But I am in this movie, and I just think he is, if I can say it, perfect in this film. And so whatever my feelings are about this particular actor, I think he is absolutely fabulous in this film. But it is a danger, because people can legitimately say, I don't like this actress, I don't like this actor, I can't tell exactly why, they just don't work for me. And so they miss out on films that might be really worth seeing. So let's go back, let's say 1941. Nobody's alive, they're all gone. And now you, as the viewer, don't know the actors. You can't say, I don't like this one, I don't like that, because you've never ever seen them before. This is your first time watching a movie, let's say, for example, The Maltese Falcon. You've never seen them. You don't know what's going on. You have to decide when you start to watch the film where the male actor, in this case private detectives, at least in these films, they're all male, is in every scene. And you say, well, this person has presence, this person has charisma oozing out of them. They are really fun to watch, and I want to watch this film, and I'm behind his shoulder watching everything that's going on. Well, that notion has existed in Hollywood since the beginning of filmmaking. And they describe it as, is this actor camera friendly? Does the camera like them? Does the camera not like them? And by this, they were describing a situation where you have two actors, both of them, as every actor and actress in Hollywood, are good looking to great looking. Are they camera friendly? Does the camera like them? Does the camera not like them? And you discovered over time, and if you followed any of this stuff, that some people who look great in person just didn't translate to the screen, and other people who look good, they just exploded on the screen. And this is a very common tale in Hollywood, such that in the mid-20s, a journalist who also worked in the film business at the same time said of an actress in the 20s, in the silent era, I don't know what it is, but she has it. And it meaning whatever it is that made them come alive on the screen. And this actress was forever called the It Girl after this person wrote this article. That actress happened to be a person named Clara Bow, and she was the It Girl, which means she had that thing that just exploded on the screen. So we as moviegoers have to take that same position and say, can we decide if this person really has enormous charisma, it just jumps off the screen, and we really want to watch this movie. We don't know anything about their backstory, if they were nasty people or wonderful people, if they were born rich or born poor, if they've had 4 divorces or never, we don't know anything about them. All we know is what we see on the screen, which is the best way to see a movie, I think. And so so we learn as movie goers to adopt this philosophy and to see if it works. Like, okay, I understand why this film is good, because that character actor up there, they're just dominating the screen. They are really fun to watch and go through. And there's been all of the Hollywood stars between 1930 up to, I don't know, maybe the present day, but certainly until the late 60s or 70s, where the actors in these films really were stars. They really just exploded on the screen. And so that's really critical. And in the case of Chinatown, I find that it's very successful. So we have our Jake Gittes, our detective, who's in every scene, who is following the story. We have our leading lady, who is also alive. Her name is Faye Dunaway. She does, I think, a terrific job of being this rich, aloof, but very vulnerable femme fatale who comes into contact with Jake through the course of the story. And we follow the two of them and all the things that go on the tricks and all the turns and things. And it's all very well done. Faye Dunaway was a big star at the time, an A-list actress. She had made a movie about 7 years earlier that catapulted her to superstardom, and that film was called, not surprisingly, Bonnie and Clyde. She played Bonnie Parker. A very innovative film directed by a fellow named Arthur Penn. So she was a big star already, and with this movie that they thought was going to be big, and they got Jack Nicholson, who was also a big star at this time, but he would go on to become even bigger than he was. And Dunaway was the right female to play opposite him in this film. So the pieces were put together, the story was terrific, and away we go. There's one other actor in this film, one of the owners, who we have to decide if he's pulling the strings, if he's really a bad guy or not so much a bad guy, but he's a major character in this film. And this old rich guy was played by John Huston. And what goes around comes around. John Huston directed The Maltese Falcon in 1941. So here's a guy who can say, I was at the beginning of the success of this genre with The Maltese Falcon, and here I am in Chinatown, perhaps the culmination of all the tropes and all the ideas of how to make these detective fiction films. And he was right there at that one too. So it's kind of cool that he was involved in both these movies. So that leads me to direction. Now, I don't like to talk too much about directors and say, well, this movie was poorly directed or this was a great directing performance. I don't know that much about directing. I've made a couple of videos and I've said action and cut, but Do we really know how much impact a director can make on a film? You might say yes. I'm not particularly convinced about that. I do know one thing for sure. The director is the boss. That's undisputed. For most of the period I talk about, and certainly for this film, the producers in the 30s and 40s at times, and the studio heads did have a lot of sway, but ultimately the director is the boss. Secondly, the director puts the camera where it's supposed to go. Now, they might do that in conjunction with the director of photography, but ultimately it's the director's call of where are we going to stick the camera and say action. And so that's important too. Now, after that, say, well, the director must coax a tremendous performance out of the cast of the film. Well, not every director thought so. There's a very famous director that I mentioned briefly in an earlier episode, whose name is Alfred Hitchcock, and he was noted for hiring the best people he could get, professionals, big stars. And then he said, okay, you do your job. I know you can do it. You do your job. I'm going to shoot the picture. I'm going to film. I'm going to help edit it. I'm going to do all the scenes that I want to do, but don't ask me about motivation or all these other things that directors may or may not do to coax their performances. He didn't believe in that. So it's a bit of a debatable area. And I'll just say that the director puts the camera where it's supposed to go and yells action and cut, and hopefully works closely with the screenwriter if they've got a good story to keep that story on track, to keep the picture tight, and to do all the things that good directors do. But let's talk about the director of this film, and his name is Roman Polanski, who was a Polish fellow, and at the age of 7 in Poland, when the Germans overran Poland at the beginning of the Second World War, they were taken into captivity. His family, his father and he were sent to one concentration camp, his mother sent to a different one. He never saw his mother again. She died before the war ended. His father survived the war, and he, of course, survived the war, although he apparently had escaped from the camp and was running around Poland trying to just survive. And in fact, some of that is chronicled in a film he did much after Chinatown called The Pianist, in which he sort of describes his character played by Adrian Brody, who is trying to survive the occupation by the German army. It's a nice little film. It's very tough, of course, given the subject matter. But Polanski had no childhood. He was in the middle of this horrible thing that happened in Europe. Now let's rush ahead. He survives. He moves through Europe. He somehow, it doesn't really matter. He gets into the film business. He starts making movies. He's pretty good at it. He gets to America. He has a pretty decent reputation. He keeps making films. And then in 1968, he makes a movie which, if he didn't already have a good reputation, he had a fabulous reputation. And it's a fun film. And I'm not a huge fan of horror, but it is in the horror mystery category, genre. And it was very well thought of at the time, and I got to tell you, it is a fun film, and it's called Rosemary's Baby, released in 1968, and it definitely catapulted him to superstar status. So, good on him, Polanski. He's now at the top of the world, doing whatever he wants. He meets around this time, before the film, I'm sure, an actress, gorgeous, blonde, nothing new about that in Hollywood, but they meet, they fall in love, and they get married. Her name was Sharon Tate, and I think she might have starred in one of his films before Rosemary's Baby, and he was going to bring her along, and there's talk about how she could have been a very accomplished actress. Well, 8 months pregnant, a year later, and I don't know where Polanski was, but I don't think it was in Los Angeles, or I don't know if he was in the country or not, but he wasn't in Los Angeles. And Sharon Tate is out with friends one night in summer of 1969. I think it was August of 1969. And on that night, she and her 4 friends were murdered by disciples of Charles Manson. You may or may not know the story. Charles Manson was a manipulative, well, it's easy to say, a very, very disturbed person. He and his disciples all ended up in prison. He died in prison. Some of them I don't know if they died or not. A couple of them were released after a long period of time, but it was just horrific. An 8-month pregnant woman murdered for no particular reason other than the reasons why Manson was trying to do whatever he was trying to do by manipulating these people. So Polanski, who had as bad a childhood as anybody could have during the Holocaust and trying to survive on his own as a 7 and 8-year-old to early teens, And that wasn't enough. He had to lose his wife to this horrific, violent event. How he survived that, who knows? He made a couple of films after this event, but I just can't help but think that when he saw the script and was perhaps offered the job of directing it and saw the potential, I can only hope that he just dove in head first into this project to somehow manage whatever pain that he was going through, and I think probably went through for the rest of his life. He's a very complicated fellow, and there's been a lot written about him, and you've probably, if you haven't heard about Polanski, there's a lot going on. He's still alive. He's still making movies. He's made a lot of good movies. But Chinatown, whatever he did as a director, whether staying close to the script and working closely with Robert Towne, who was the writer of the script, who knows? But the results are spectacular. And he has a cameo in the film. And I tell you, if you've never seen Chinatown and you see this film, you will never forget this cameo. Believe me, you will never forget it. So that's all I want to say about director Roman Polanski. So the last thing I want to talk about is the music. Now, I like opening credits. Sometimes they're really fun. If you've ever heard of a film called The Pink Panther, the very, very first film called The Pink Panther, they got really fun credits, and the music's kind of cool too, and it's this cartoon Pink Panther who dances around. But credits can be fun. They can be very ordinary. The credits in Chinatown start out, it's just this funky background, and it's just the text and the actors and actresses involved. But 20 seconds in, there's a horn solo, and that horn solo elevates everything. It's moody. It just creates a tone that you carry with you for the rest of the film, and it's used sparingly. So it's used at the opening credits, and you may not hear it for a few minutes, and then some point in the film, at what it seems to be the most appropriate point, the horn solo returns. And I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 times in the film you hear it, but it absolutely is mesmerizing. And I think every detective film after Chinatown has a horn or a saxophone of the same ilk and the same kind of sound to give it that tone of a typical depressing, difficult people who are suffering, who are trying to make ends meet in a very hard world where the good guys often lose and the bad guys win. It's just wonderful. And I think Chinatown would be great, in my opinion, a film I would like without it. But with it, it's just like it wasn't necessary, but they made the film even better than it was. For me, I just think that the experience was even more fantastic. A horn solo. So Chinatown, so much has been written about it and talked about over the years. It is a very well thought of film. It is one of my favorite films, and again, that's all that matters to me. Even if it wasn't well thought of, it's my favorite, one of my favorite films. And what I've talked about here just basically scratches the surface of all the things you can talk about with this movie. It's Hollywood at its finest in storytelling, in the use of sound, in the use of actors who absolutely are captivating on screen. All of the best things about Hollywood storytelling you can find in this film. Well, that's how Chinatown looks to me from the 22nd